And when I was that little baby police officer running around in a uniform, I was still acclimatizing, still trying to figure things out. So things shocked me.
Right.
And so I developed back then something I called the squinty eyes technique.
Yeah.
Man found dead over a random attack.
About a spike in domestic violence.
Hello to you, Dave.
Hello, Nicole.
How's it going?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good, good. I'm doing good. Riveting stuff we're getting from you, and today will be no different, I'm sure. We're going to be touching on building resiliency and dealing with death. And death is something that everybody experiences,
Yeah.
a few times potentially in their lives. So something I think a lot of us are going to be able to relate to in hearing your perspective. So as a retired homicide detective, you have seen countless dark, heavy days. A heaviness that many of us, I'm sure, can't even imagine. In our first episode, we talked a lot about life of service and what that meant to you. And it was really about leaving people better than how you found them. Mm-hmm. And you wanted to be of service to the community and to help. Through that, though, you have had to build insane resiliency in the conversations that you've had with families. So let's start off with a particular case that you worked on where you felt like you really got a notch in your resiliency belt, so to speak.
Sure. I mean, I think to be honest with you, there's been many,
Yeah.
And it's sort of been a slow process. But when I think back, and I really believe, like when it comes to resiliency, that there is an opportunity to be able to reframe or look at things in a different way in almost every situation that we come across.
Yeah.
And I know that we're going to get more into it here in a bit. But, you would say, well, how is that possible? How could you do that in some of these circumstances and situations? Like one that I dealt with a few years ago where I had been called as one of two investigators to the death of an infant. And this is a fairly common call that we would go to a couple times a month. And obviously extremely emotional, very, very difficult for the family that's lost a son or a daughter.
Of course.
And one that we have to be very conscious about, the sensitivities of it all, while trying to carry out our job or perform our function, which is to try and ascertain what may have happened to the young one.
Right.
And so we do that in collaboration with the medical examiner's office, and we'll talk more about that in an upcoming podcast. But in this particular instance, we had been called, the infant was maybe 3-4 months of age. And the family, as you can imagine, once the medical examiner got there and learned that we'd be removing the baby from the home, how resistant they were to that.
Right.
Like, that would be difficult.
Of course,
Be the first night away from their son. And I remember thinking, oh man, how are we going to find a silver lining or, offer some sort of a different perspective that's going to make this okay?
Right. A little less painful.
Yeah. And so it was just the beauty and the care of the medical examiner that actually is the one that brought the idea to the family, which ultimately led them to them surrendering the baby to us.
Okay.
And what she said, and what was so meaningful and impactful, was this: she recognized first their loss, right? She was in a place where she was definitely empathetic to their concerns.
Yep.
But she offered this, which is what made all the difference in the world. That baby held a secret that could potentially go on to save other babies that the family would have into the future, or other children that they already had. and an examination of that baby would ultimately be the thing that would sort of provide some clarity of what happened and how the young one died.
Right. And to kind of start that grieving process a little bit.
And so she almost framed it as it was a gift,
Right.
a sacrifice from
That your
one
baby
child.
could give.
Yes.
Similar to like organ donation or something.
That's right.
Yeah.
Like it's this idea that your baby holds the key to underlying health conditions
Right.
that could affect other members in your family. Once we can identify what that is, then we're going to share that information with you
Yeah.
and future children and the children you already have, the information that they knew that could potentially save their other babies' lives into the future.
Are there certain, like, as a mom, I'd imagine that seeing children and babies would be extra difficult.
Yeah.
Would you agree, or do you get to the point where a body is,
Well, I don't.
devastation regardless?
I think it's a dangerous place to get to a point where it becomes completely normalized.
Right.
I mean, certainly in my life, it did become quite normal.
Right.
But death, when we see it, whether it's the first time or the 100th time, it isn't normal.
Right.
It's not something we see or routinely deal with every day.
Makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
But I do think that, like, one of the things. So with that said, I think that when I think about dealing with anything unpleasant or uncomfortable, it's really, first of all, recognizing that it's not me that's
Right.
involved in that situation.
Right.
I don't make the tragedy about me. I don't make the crisis about
Right.
me.
You separate yourself.
100%. And I always remind myself of what my purpose is. We talk about, way back at the beginning, we talk about a life of service and what are, and that mantra. For me, one of the things that comes as part of that is understanding your purpose.
Yeah.
And my purpose was always the investigation of crime and basically solving mysteries.
Yeah, because I'd assume if you act as a sponge and take on all of these tragedies, it can be a very dangerous place mentally.
It could be, and also I think you're doing a bit of a disservice.
Right.
Because
you
it's
can't put
taking-
yourself in the scenario that you need to be in.
Right. You're taking away from your purpose. If my
Right.
purpose is to figure out what happened, I can't get so convoluted into the emotion of the event.
Right. Right.
And it is honestly not my tragedy. So sometimes people will say, well, how do you deal with that? Well, the first thing is it's not to deal with. That would be making it about me.
Right.
And it's not. It's about this person. And now this is who I'm here to serve. This is who I'm here to,
Yes. This is part of my role.
Right.
Right.
And so we're keeping that in mind was always really, really key and critical.
And like you say, you'll never get used to it, but there are ways that you can acclimatize through experience.
That's right. It is. It's an acclimation process. Those very first years as just a uniformed police officer driving around, we went to sudden deaths.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't an abundant call, but you probably went to a dozen or so a year.
Okay.
And then as time went on, I mean, I could go to a dozen people that have passed in homicide within a month, right? Because we didn't just deal with homicides. We dealt with anything that was deemed suspicious by the Office of the Medical Examiner.
Okay. Okay.
But I do think that, like, acclimatization is a big part of being able to get to a point where you can remind yourself of purpose.
Yes. Yes.
And when I was that little baby police officer running around in a uniform, I was still acclimatizing, still trying to figure things out. So things shocked me.
Right.
And so I developed back then something I called the squinty eyes technique.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what that was it was very, very, simple. It came as a result of a case where I'd been called to a home on a sudden death of a little old lady. And she died, I think, the way many of us would wish to die. But when I arrived, her family was seated in their vehicles out front, and they came up to me and said, if you go around to the back, you'll find our aunt at the back of the house. So I said, okay, thank you. Back then I was practicing sympathy. I'm sorry for your loss.
Right. Right.
And off I went in through the back patio door and almost fell into her. I wasn't prepared. Even
Right.
though it was a natural, benign passing, I wasn't been prepared for what was in front of me. And what it was a little old lady with a rum and coke in her hand and an Afghan blanket over her lap sitting in her chair.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it shocked me.
Yes.
And so after that, I'm like, you know what? So those situations aren't as shocking. I'm going to start doing this, the squinty eyes technique. So what that did was, what I would do is I go to a scene, I would close my eyes, and then I would just start to open them up enough so that they would blur.
Right.
And once I could blur my eyes to the scene, I'd have a general idea of how the scene was laid out and what I was going to be bearing witness to. And then when I was ready, I gave myself the opportunity to open my eyes
Right.
so I could get that full blast.
Yeah.
So I brought it
It's not such a shock.
Right, it brought the scene into stages.
Right.
I mean, certainly over a 25-year career, my experience around death acts now like the squinty eyes did back then, right?
Right.
Like I don't need to do that, but just because of the experience. But leading up to that place,
Yeah. Yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
But yeah, so acclimatization is one part of it.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you have like an injury or something and you don't really want to look at it, but you can almost I like that squinty eye technique
Yeah.
in all facets of life where it's something that you don't want it to shock you, but you need to just slowly acclimatize to it. I think it could help in a lot of ways too, right?
Before you give yourself that full blast. Right?
Yeah, that can be scary
Yeah.
and make it so much worse.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
totally.
And so you talk about acclimatization.
Yeah.
Compartmentalization. We've got all the big words today, but
Yeah.
that one also plays a big part into how you actually deal with all of it too.
Right. So I mean, I think, we talk about it in the book in terms of, it depends on what side of the desk you're on. If this is
Right.
a good thing or a bad thing.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, for us, it's what allowed me to do the work that I did for so long.
Yeah.
And it was like really storing off the negative things into a different separate place in my brain.
Right. Right.
And then putting in place of that my purpose, right? Which was, again, investigating crime and stuff like that. So I never focused on the rigid hands of a victim.
Right.
Instead, I thought about, what type of evidence may be found underneath their fingernails.
Yeah.
I never looked at the age of a deceased and say to myself, oh my gosh, that person reminds me of whoever in my life.
Right.
Instead, I looked around the scene to see whether or not there was clues in there.
Right. Right.
And that perspective, I think, came a little bit from, again, our backgrounds have such an influence, but I came from a family of science.
Yeah. In fact.
And fact, and
Yeah.
faith, and so having that in my background, I think certainly helped me in terms of being able to do that and just really remind myself I'm there to focus on the facts.
And is there a case that comes in mind where you really had to practice that compartmentalization?
I remember a case years ago where a young one had gone through a horrific experience involving a parent. And I was asked to go to the autopsy the following day. And so when I showed up there, it was a full day thing, a full day examination. And I left the autopsy that day at the autopsy suite, and I went home, and I actually went off to coach my son hockey, of all things, that
yeah.
night.
Yeah.
What a dichotomy, hey?
Yeah, no kidding.
It's these weird...
Yes. Extremes.
Yeah. So then that night at about 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night, I happened to be talking to a colleague of mine who had called me just to ask how things were going.
Yeah.
And I said, you know what, man? I feel like I lost my whole day. I don't even remember what I did earlier that day.
So consumed.
Well, but I said to him, I said, I think I did 2/10 of F all today.
When you had it.
He goes, weren't you at that autopsy? I'm like, bingo, I was.
Wow. So it hit you that intensely.
Intensely, where it was just completely obliterated out of my mind.
Wow. But you knew that was...
But as soon as he
way to
said
go
it,
about
he
it.
brought it back.
Yeah, of course.
It wasn't like I completely forgot I had amnesia about it.
No, of course. But it's almost like a
But that's
coping mechanism.
That's compartmentalization.
Yeah. Wow.
And when I moved into retirement, I still to this day worry about it a little bit.
Right.
You know, I think this is one of the reasons why this type of thing is so important, is to talk about the experiences on some level.
Yeah, of course.
And because I'm worried that one day, like maybe those things that some doctors would be worried about, those images that you've stored off in your brain, they may
Right.
start to come back to me in
Right.
different ways.
Yeah, well, they have like all sorts of therapy too, where they force you to go back, let's say, to your childhood
Right.
and try to remember a day that you might have blacked out completely,
Yeah.
just to be able to cope.
Yeah.
But I know that bringing a lot of that up can also be healing in a lot of ways.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Like it can be traumatizing and healing. Like it's
Yeah, I
sort of
know.
a bit of both. Because,
You have to be
you know,
ready
as
to
I sit
face
here and
it.
talk to you, it's like my mind goes through like, it's like a Rolodex of things.
Mm-hmm.
And none of them are like necessarily pleasant.
Right. Yeah.
But I try to like, and then I try to like parse out the important pieces of information
Yeah, exactly. And the lessons.
for our viewers.
Yeah, which is what
And
it's
for
all
our
about.
listeners.
Yeah. Which also is kind of an extension of your life of service, because it's like now, in addition to what you've done in your career, you can share the knowledge and continue to be of service to people.
I hope so. Like
Yeah.
in some way, shape, or form. What I would I encourage about, like, I don't know that compartmentalization is a technique that many people are going to have to use day in and day out, like
Right.
we did.
Right.
But I do think the next part of this whole thing
Mm-hmm.
is, and it's that ability to reframe.
Yep. Right.
And I really believe reframing is a key to happiness.
Mm-hmm.
We have two ways of looking at anything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, earlier we touched on like how we reframe the idea or concept in a previous podcast about going to jail.
Right. Make
Like,
it
it's
a positive.
Right. It's a reset. It's an opportunity, you know?
Yep. Yep.
Well, we could reframe anything. And I would challenge anybody
Yeah.
to give me a scenario that can't be reframed in one way or another. It may be difficult to do. And I shouldn't say, there are circumstances that are just, how could you ever get there?
Right. Right.
But I think we can find a silver lining in almost everything.
For sure.
We just
for
have
sure.
to look.
And we're going to be talking about building legacy in a
Yeah.
future episode as well. And I know a lot of families that I've known who have dealt with a loss of a child
Yeah.
have been masters at taking this sorrow and turning it as like rocket fuel, basically.
Yes.
And redirecting the pain and making it joyful. Hey,
Yeah.
we still have today. We can dance today. Let's dance today.
Yeah.
And just like, we're not going to fill all of our days with this extreme worry and pain. Let's use it as rocket fuel and turn it around.
And that is reframing.
Yeah,
That is finding the silver lining. It is difficult to do, you know,
It's
but if you
totally.
practice it every day,
Yeah.
it actually can cultivate a habit of appreciation.
Yeah.
I had a father, he taught me about this.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't know he taught me, but he did. It was my very first investigation in homicide. And we had started to go through the sort of the doldrums of the justice system and the court system. And we had now, it was a couple years later. So now I had a little bit of time in the unit, a couple years. And we're going to a trial. And really the basic part of the case was this. Two associates get into a fight.
Yep.
One takes the life of another. But these guys were known to each other prior. And as the father sat there the father of the victim sat there in the courtroom, in the benches sort of behind the bar, he was looking across the way and saw the accused father sitting on the other side of the benches. And afterwards, he came up to me and said, you know, Dave, I have been feeling so grief-stricken, so upset, so despondent over the loss of my son. And for good reason, I loved my son. However, when I sit where I sat today and looked at that man, I realized that there could be no worse hell than knowing that my son took his son's life.
Wow.
And that for him was the reframe. He's going through something, but what he's going through isn't nearly as difficult as somebody else.
Yeah, definitely.
And I love that. That was the precipice essentially for me starting to see the world differently.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we talk about divorce, and how difficult that can be in a person's life. And it can be a terribly gut-wrenching experience. But there are silver linings that come out of it as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I always said to people, can you imagine if you were married to somebody who resented you all the way through your 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and now you're in your 70s or 80s and you need to have your diaper changed?
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Do you really want that person in the room with you doing it?
Exactly.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
So divorce gives us that opportunity to find the person that would be willing
Right.
to
Yeah.
go to that level of care for us.
And I know many people who, once their parents finally decided to separate, it was a blessing
That's
for
right.
everybody involved. And whereas they tried to hang on for as long as
Right.
possible because they thought they should.
Right.
I want to touch on how you have an ability to see things with a glass half full, almost because you've had so much heaviness in your life that when you get to experience joy, you almost really experience it under like a microscope or a magnifying glass, I guess I should say, because you really relish in when people are happy and joyful because you know the other side of it too.
Well, even just like, you and I talking about your own family. And like, I love the stories about the girls and like some of the things that they're doing. And I think back to those times.
Right. Yeah.
And I am so glad that it's a beautiful life for them.
Yeah.
And I think about how lucky, we all are as parents or aunts and uncles. They get to go off and see like a school play or a musical or whatever it is.
Yeah, yeah.
These are the most important parts of our life.
Yeah.
And they're missed if we're caught up in grief and sorrow.
And they go so fast.
They do.
Yeah, but you're really good at that. Every text message, if I'm like, oh, someone's homesick from school, it's like, it's okay, just enjoy those cuddles. You kind of,
Yes.
You're very good at giving me the perspective shift that I sometimes also, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right.
Well, you're just in such
well.
from my seat, you're in such it's in such an enviable position.
Right.
Because if I could do it all over again, I would.
Yeah, you would. Hey?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's resiliency. It's not necessarily, it takes time, I guess, and a lot of experience. But it's something that you've definitely, kind of figured out, I guess, throughout your career, you've had to.
But I think we all can.
Yeah.
Like that's,
yeah.
I mean,
course.
reframing is so important.
Yeah.
And we see it in so many different ways, and we will touch on it more later.
Yeah.
But, for people that are out there that are suffering from something, flip it.
Yeah.
And you know what? Maybe you can't. But if you have a devil's advocate in your corner, that person might be able to for you.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
I used to think, there are so many situations that you would think they're impossible to reframe or flip. You lose your job tomorrow. Well, guess what? You get to go back to school
Right. Yeah.
and focus on something you really want to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then
Then it's a blessing in
it's a
disguise.
blessing in disguise.
Yeah. So what would you say your main takeaway is, like, from today's episode?
The biggest takeaway for me is reframing. If you practice it every day, will cultivate a habit of appreciation.
Right.
And I believe it wholeheartedly. And it's hard to do sometimes, but it can work.
Yeah.
We just came out of a extremely cold winter, like the last part of the winter.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have to tell you that, if there was a day that my car kind of turned over and almost didn't start or didn't start, I'd be frustrated by that situation, but thank the world that I have a car.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because how many people don't?
Yeah. It's so true.
And so that's what we do. We have
Yeah.
to, that's how we do it. And that's how we we can reframe anything.
And like you say in the book, perspective is the antidote to worry.
So true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, having that is so true.
Yeah. And I think it's important to also allow yourself those feelings, right, when you're in them. And once you've kind of had time to absorb it, the perspective angle can definitely come in and help you move forward. But also realizing that it's not necessarily like, oh, it could be worse. So,
Yeah.
I'm not going to sit with this. I think that's important too, to sit with those feelings.
If you have an idea on if you want to find the place in the world
Yeah.
that you will get the best appreciation for perspective, visit a children's hospital.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you will understand the difference of perspective. You know, in one of my children's lives, at a very young age, he was diagnosed with a very serious heart illness. And although we felt bad, I have to tell you that there were so many families that wished their child had our son's issue because they were dealing with so much more than what our son was dealing with.
Totally. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
And in
that
that sense, you
perspective-
feel lucky.
That
Almost.
perspective.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I do. I think that's a beautiful, sort of a beautiful way to end today is just thinking about that, is recognizing perspective.
Yeah. And something we can practice every day.
Totally.
Along with empathy, like we've talked about in a previous episode.
Yeah.
These are all things that, you know, that throughout the book, you've really helped shed some light
Yeah.
on as well. And we've got some exciting things also coming up in future episodes. We're talking about success and owning your path.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, and I know, you know, success comes differently to a lot of people. I know society can play a big part where what you feel success actually looks like,
Yeah.
but it's not necessarily the case. You need to find out who you are and what success looks like to
That's
you.
right.
So thanks for the convo today, Dave.
Thanks, Nicole.
All right, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, we hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Ride Along. And if you're interested in learning more about Dave's career and the lessons he learned throughout, now that he's on the other side of it, be sure to pick up a copy of his book that he co-wrote with Sarah Cades called Skeletons in My Closet. And keep an eye out for his new release, Undaunted, with Susan Forrest.
My mantra of leaving people better than you found them continues to be my driver. And I hope you're leaving this podcast today feeling inspired, informed, and inclined to live your dash. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please be sure to like and subscribe. And take care, everybody. Thanks for joining us on The Ride Along.